Hey everybody, Uncle Jerry here, coming to you today from the Bayou Teche. You remember I talked about that yesterday. You see the bayou behind me. It's one of the major bayous in the state. It covers a large portion of the state. And because of this, the Yankees put gunboats in it during the war. Now can you imagine being here in this little small town that's behind where I'm standing, and a 200 or 300 foot long ironclad Yankee gunboat with cannons sticking all out the side was basically in your backyard? I'm sure they were scared to death. And speaking of cannons, tomorrow when I talk to you, we'll talk about cannons and the rifles and the other weapons that both North and South used to wage the war. But today what I want to talk to you about is one of the major battles that happened during the war. And I've studied the Civil War for years, and it's turned in to be one of my favorite battles I like to read about, and I've actually visited the battlefield before. And it's kind of two battles in one. And the first battle was the Battle of Fredericksburg, Virginia. And then that's going to lead to the second one that I'll talk about. So I'll use this piece of wood here to kind of illustrate what happened in both the battles. Fredericksburg is a real pretty town. There's a river that runs along the bottom of this little valley here. And the Confederates were set up at the top of this ridge. They knew that the Yankees were coming down from Washington to attack them. So they found a really good spot up here and set up. And the Yankees showed up on the other side of the river and laid these pontoon bridges. Now pontoon bridges are kind of like a pontoon boat you see today out on the lake. But there's several boats, they line them up and then they put wood across it so they can bring horses and men and cannons and anything they need. It's a real smart idea. So before they came across, they shot their cannons into the town for days. I don't know why. Maybe they thought the Confederates were hiding there, but they weren't. They were at the top of the hill. Bottom line is they leveled the whole town unnecessarily. They finally get across, and in dawn one morning they start to come up the hill. Well, the Confederates have been sitting up here for days getting ready for them. And as far as the general that was leading the Union Army, General Burnside, it was a really bad move for him to send these men up a clear hill with nothing to hide behind. So they ran up the hill, they shot them down, they ran up the hill, they shot them down. They did this 3 times. They never got across the wall where the Confederates were fighting from. The next morning, they said, when the sun came up, the whole hill was just covered in dead Yankee soldiers. Well, President Lincoln fired that general from the Union Army and sent down General Hooker. And up here on top of the hill for the Confederates was General Lee, General Stonewall Jackson, General Longstreet, and some of the other well-known generals. But those are the 3 top ones that were there. Well, General Lee knew that eventually the Yankees were going to figure out that if they went down and went down the river and crossed over and came around, they could get on his flank. Flank means get on your side. And so he had his cavalry out doing surveillance and watching for that. Sure enough, Hooker starts bringing about 3/4 of his troops down the river trying to do just that. He left some troops here so the Confederates would think he was still in town. So General Lee is stuck with a situation. Do I move all the troops down here to face this threat and then lose this? Or do I divide my forces? Most of the time dividing your forces is a bad plan, but that's exactly what he did. So he left about 3/4 of his troops at the top of the hill, so the Yankees would think the Confederates were still there. And he moved the rest of them down through the woods. Well, Hooker gets across the river and gets up on the hill there before General Lee arrives. But they collide in this area known as the wilderness, and it's really thick, impenetrable woods. You can't see 10, 20 feet. And so they're fighting it out for a day or so. and nobody's winning or losing. It's a draw. So General Lee realizes that he can't do this much longer, because you got to remember, the Confederates were outnumbered better than 2-1, and now they divided their forces, so it's probably more like 3-1. So he knows he can't stand there and fight this draw every day and lose men. So he gets together with some of his top generals, and they decide on this daring plan, because the cavalry has done their job yet once again. The Yankees are all lined up. There's a river here, and they're all lined up, but there's nothing on their right flank that they can lock into and have protection with. So the cavalry realized that that right flank was what they call up in the air. The line just ended. So Lee gets with Stonewall Jackson and says, do you think you can march your men around and get on that right flank? Stonewall, of course, says yes. So before the sun comes up the next morning, he takes 5,000 men and marches them 12 miles down this narrow little logging road, and then gets in the wilderness again and marches them through these thick woods until his line of 5,000 men is straddling that line of the Yankee soldiers. When everybody got lined up, it was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, they give the signal to charge, and all his men start doing the rebel yell coming through the woods. The first the Yankees knew of us was not from hearing a yell, it's because every deer, rabbit, and turkey in the woods was running through their lines. And they'd never seen this, so they were like, well, you know, what are deer doing in camp? But sure enough, in about a minute later, they heard the rebel yell, and they knew what was about to happen. And so here they are, and all of a sudden 5,000 screaming Confederates come out of the woods, and they just rolled them up like a roll of carpet. They pushed them all the way down their line, almost to the river. And at the same time, Lee pushes these forces forward as well, so they're getting them in a pinching movement. The problem for the Confederates that day is that this charge started too late. It started at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun was low in the sky. So by the time they had rolled them all the way up, it was dark. Well, Stonewall wanted to continue fighting after dark, which was something that was almost never done back then. And so he was riding through the woods trying to find out where the Yankee lines were so he could line his men up and attack them one more time. Well, during his ride, the north and south men were all mixed up in the woods because it was dark, and some Confederate soldiers from North Carolina saw his shadowy figures, he and his men, in the woods, and they opened fire. Well, one of the bullets hit Stonewall in the arm. Now the wound it was a bad wound, but it wasn't a wound that in today's world would have killed him. But the problem then, they didn't have really good medical care, so the only thing they could do was cut his arm off, and then he started to recover. But a couple of days later, he developed pneumonia, and then a couple of days after that, he died. So it was a huge loss to the Confederate war effort to lose such an outstanding general. It was a great victory, but it came at a terrible cost. So that's the Battle of Chancellorsville. Chancellorsville. You started out with Fredericksburg, and then it turned into the Battle of Chancellorsville, just down the road from it. I hope you've enjoyed this little lesson. Tomorrow we'll be talking about guns. This is Uncle Jerry coming to you from Breaux Bridge, Louisiana.